A wealthy woman discovered her African-American chauffeur sleeping outdoors. Her subsequent actions left everyone stunned. The recording equipment documented the precise instant Victoria Ashford's complexion became ashen during the media briefing. The CNN journalist had posed the inquiry she hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Ashford, can you confirm that you terminated David Thompson's employment abruptly, leaving him homeless during the previous week's blizzard?" The Ritz Hotel's grand ballroom, packed with financiers and media personnel, became utterly quiet. Victoria, age 52, had constructed a $200 million property development business founded on her flawless standing as a charitable donor committed to social equality. At this moment, before nationwide television coverage, her facade was starting to crumble. "I'm uncertain what you're referring to," she faltered, her hand shaking almost imperceptibly while she touched her strand of pearls. In the audience's third section, a 35-year-old African-American gentleman observed her every gesture with the composure of someone who had been orchestrating this encounter for several months. David Thompson maintained a peaceful demeanor, yet his gaze radiated with resolve that only individuals who have sacrificed everything and chosen to reclaim it possess. 21 days prior, David had served as Victoria's private chauffeur for 4 years, reliable, confidential, and competent. He was familiar with all her preferred routes, each private appointment, every confidential matter discussed in the vehicle's rear compartment during calls she believed were secure. To Victoria, David was unseen, merely another black staff member performing his quiet function in her elite environment. The situation transformed on a frigid Friday in December. David appeared 15 minutes behind schedule after remaining at the medical facility throughout the night with his 8-year-old child, who had experienced an asthma episode. He attempted to clarify, but Victoria interrupted him with an irritated gesture. "Your personal justifications don't concern me, David. You're either dependable or you're not," she declared without glancing away from her mobile device. "Collect your belongings and depart immediately." David remained motionless briefly, absorbing her words. 4 years of flawless service, ruined by a quarter hour of reasonable delay. "Mrs. Ashford, if I might simply—" "Security," she called out as though David posed a danger. "Select your following words wisely, Thompson." Negative recommendations spread quickly in this industry. While David collected his personal items from the employee residence, indeed, she had also removed him from there. Something within him solidified. It wasn't rage. It was something more frigid, more deliberate. For 4 years, he had been the quiet driver who observed everything, witnessed everything, documented everything mentally. Victoria was unaware that David had earned his degree from Howard University in business studies, but had accepted the driving position to provide for his child and his mother with diabetes. She was also ignorant that he possessed remarkable recall abilities and extensive experience watching how influential individuals conducted their questionable activities. Returning to the media conference, the journalist pressed her attack. "We possess details that Mr. Thompson was discovered resting in his vehicle during a winter storm after being removed without advance notice. How does someone who claims to champion civil rights explain this behavior?" Victoria attempted to recover her poise, but her voice emerged unsteady. "That represents a complete misrepresentation of the circumstances. David Thompson was let go for legitimate reasons following numerous policy breaches." At that moment, David gradually rose to his feet. Every gaze shifted toward him. With unsettling composure, he opened a dark attaché case and raised several papers into the air. "Mrs. Ashford," he stated, his voice resonating throughout the quiet auditorium, "are you certain you wish to persist with this account of events?" The color left Victoria's face completely. She instantly identified some of those documents, papers she believed were secure in her personal office. However, what frightened her most was a composed smile on David's expression. It wasn't the expression of someone wronged. It was the expression of someone who had invested weeks preparing for this encounter with methodical accuracy. If this tale of unfairness and reversal captures your interest, remember to follow the channel, because David's briefcase contents represented merely the beginning of a strategy that would transform the city's most influential woman into another cautionary tale about the repercussions of undervaluing those you mistreat while advancing your career. The atmosphere in the Ritz's ballroom was intense. Victoria Ashford attempted to regain command of the circumstances, straightening her jacket and forcing a frigid smile. Mr. Thompson, I'm uncertain what sort of performance this represents. But performance? David interjected, his voice slicing through the atmosphere like a blade. Mrs. Ashford, do you recall this telephone discussion? He raised his mobile phone, and everyone could hear Victoria's distinctive voice broadcasting through the hotel's audio equipment. I'm indifferent if your child is hospitalized, David. Individuals like you consistently have melodramatic justifications. Either you function professionally or you return to the slums from which you originated. The quiet that ensued was overwhelming. Cameras zeroed in on Victoria's expression, which had lost all pigmentation. Media representatives started murmuring amongst themselves, some already frantically typing on their devices. That statement was misrepresented, she stuttered, but her voice sounded feeble and frantic. David remained expressionless. Misrepresented? Let's provide additional context. Then he methodically turned through his papers. Hospital documentation for my child Sophie, 8 years old, demonstrating that she was brought to the medical facility in the early morning of December 15th with a serious asthma episode. Here's the timestamp, 2:37 a.m. He displayed the documents to the cameras. And here are text communications I transmitted to you explaining the circumstances, requesting merely 15 minutes to ensure my child could breathe properly before operating your vehicle. What Victoria was unaware of, what she never troubled to discover, was David Thompson's true identity. A distinguished business graduate from Howard University. He had abandoned a promising corporate future when his spouse perished in an incident, leaving him alone to raise Sophie and tend to his diabetic mother. Accepting the chauffeur position wasn't degrading. It was tactical. David understood that influential individuals spoke openly before invisible people like himself. For 4 years, he internalized every discussion, committed every detail to memory, mentally cataloged every questionable scheme he overheard in that BMW's backseat. Mrs. Ashford, David continued, do you also recall compelling me to work 17 consecutive hours on my child's birthday because emergencies don't acknowledge sentimental occasions? Victoria attempted to stand, but her legs were noticeably trembling. I never express it precisely in that manner. No. David smiled for the first time, an expression that didn't extend to his eyes. Then perhaps I should refresh your recollection with additional recordings. The CNN journalist, recognizing the historic moment developing before her cameras, posed a question everyone wanted answered. Mr. Thompson, how did you obtain all this proof? David faced her with the patience of an educator explaining a clear lesson. When you're regarded as furniture for 4 years, individuals forget that furniture possesses sight, hearing, and occasionally perfect memory. That was when Victoria committed her most catastrophic error. Driven by the desperation and arrogance that had sustained her for decades, she erupted. You're accepting the testimony of a chauffeur? I constructed an empire. I contribute millions to charitable causes, and you're going to believe him. The room became silent. Every individual present had just observed the mask finally slip entirely. David simply nodded gradually, as though she had confirmed something he had been anticipating. And it's exactly that attitude, Miss Ashford, that has led you to this moment. He addressed the cameras, and for the first time, everyone could perceive the exceptional intelligence behind those eyes that Victoria had opted to disregard for years. For 4 years, I was a driver for a woman who views herself as a philanthropist while compelling staff to rest in vehicles during blizzards. A woman who donates millions publicly while refusing 15 minutes of compassion to a desperate father. Victoria attempted one final strategy. David, we can resolve this amicably. I can offer you substantial compensation. Compensation. David laughed, a bitter sound. Mrs. Ashford, you still don't comprehend. This was never about financial gain. He looked directly at her, and Victoria felt a chill travel down her spine. There was something in his gaze, a cold, calculated determination she recognized from her own business transactions, but intensified by years of suppressed injustice. Every evening I spent resting in my vehicle after you removed me. Every meal my child had to forego because I couldn't afford both food and medication. Every tear my mother shed believing she had raised someone unsuccessful. All of that provided me time to plan this moment very meticulously. The financiers in the audience began to move restlessly. Some were already composing messages, probably to their legal representatives. Victoria's standing, and by association of anyone connected to her, was deteriorating in real time. However, what truly terrified Victoria was understanding that David hadn't disclosed even half of what he carried in that dark briefcase. The calm expression on his face belonged to someone who had choreographed every second of that moment, every word, every disclosure. For 4 years, she had completely misjudged the man who operated her vehicle. Now, too late, she was starting to comprehend that she might have committed the greatest error of her life by provoking the anger of someone who possessed not only exceptional intelligence but also limitless patience and a memory that retained absolutely everything. With each document he displayed, with each recording he broadcast, it became more apparent that this wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. It was a careful implementation of a strategy that had been months in development, months of apparent silence and compliance. David Thompson had converted every humiliation into motivation, every injustice into evidence, every frigid night into inspiration for what was approaching. And Victoria, with all her arrogance and privilege, was finally starting to understand that she had underestimated not merely an employee, she had underestimated an opponent who was engaged in chess while she still believed she was playing checkers. While Victoria attempted to regain her composure before the cameras, her mind raced frantically, trying to assess the damage. However, what she couldn't comprehend was that this media conference hadn't been coincidental. It had been orchestrated with the accuracy of a military strategy. 3 weeks earlier, when David Thompson had been abandoned in the snow, he hadn't simply accepted his circumstances. Sitting on the frozen park bench, shivering while his daughter slept in the car's backseat, he had made a decision that would alter everything. Victoria Ashford had selected the incorrect adversary. "Papa, why can't we return home?" Sophie had inquired, her 8 years unable to understand why they were sleeping in the car. Because sometimes, darling, powerful individuals believe they can trample those they consider less significant, David had responded, adjusting the blanket around her. But they forget that underestimated people are the most dangerous. What Victoria never realized was that David had spent the previous 2 years carefully recording every suspicious discussion, every questionable phone call, every discriminatory remark she made in that BMW's backseat. His perfect memory wasn't limited to numbers. He remembered every date, every name, every detail of the corrupt transaction she conducted, believing she was protected by her driver's invisibility. The day following the eviction, David had contacted someone he knew only by reputation. Rachel Morrison, a CNN investigative reporter who had been attempting for years to find a method to expose the real estate elite schemes. She had answered the phone with skepticism. However, when David began reciting specific discussions between Victoria and corrupt officials from memory, including precise dates and amounts mentioned, her skepticism transformed into genuine curiosity. "Can you verify any of this?" Rachel had inquired during their first secret meeting in a dim Brooklyn cafe. David smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mrs. Morrison, not only can I verify it, I possess recordings, photographs of documents she left scattered in her vehicle, and a memory that has recorded every crime she committed while thinking I was deaf and blind." Rachel nearly spilled her coffee. "You recorded her conversations for 4 years." "Not all of them," David replied calmly. "Just the ones involving bribing inspectors, manipulating public contracts, and some particularly revealing comments about keeping certain people in their place." He slid a folder across the table. "This is merely a sample." For the following 3 weeks, Rachel and David functioned like a detective team. She verified every piece of information he provided, cross-referenced data, confirmed details. What they discovered was an empire constructed on systematic corruption, institutionalized discrimination, and an arrogance so deep that Victoria had documented her own crimes in conversations she believed were private. "David, this isn't just about your unfair termination," Rachel had said the week before the media conference. "This concerns decades of a corrupt system that she helped construct. You possess sufficient evidence to bring down not just her, but 6 politicians and business figures." However, David had an even more sophisticated plan. He didn't simply want to expose Victoria. He wanted to accomplish it in the most humiliating manner possible, before the very people she had always tried to impress. The media conference had been the ideal stage, an event where she would feel secure and powerful, surrounded by allies and investors. "She'll attempt to discredit me by claiming I'm just a bitter driver," David had predicted during the planning. "It's that arrogance that will destroy her." Rachel had smiled. And when she does, it will be the perfect moment to reveal who you truly are and what else you know. Now, back in the Ritz ballroom, Victoria made exactly the mistake David had anticipated. "You're going to accept the word of a driver," she had said, her contempt echoing through the silent hall. David merely nodded as if she had triggered a trap he had carefully set. "Thank you for that question, Mrs. Ashford, because now I can introduce someone who possesses much more credibility than a maid driver." He gestured, and Rachel Morrison rose from the audience, her CNN identification clearly visible. "Ms. Ashford, I'm Rachel Morrison, investigative journalist. Over the past 3 weeks, our team has independently confirmed every one of Mr. Thompson's claims. Would you like to respond to the fraudulent affordable housing contracts we've documented, or would you prefer to discuss the bribes paid to City Inspector Johnson?" Victoria's face lost all color. She recognized the name instantly. Johnson was a most crucial contact at City Hall, responsible for expediting approvals for her projects in exchange for generous consulting payments. "I don't understand what you're referring to," she stammered, but her voice emerged weak and unconvincing. David calmly turned through his folder and raised another document. "Ms. Ashford, do you remember this phone conversation on March 17th of last year? You said, and I quote directly, 'Johnson, the affordable housing project requires approval this week. You understand your son needs that scholarship my foundation provides, don't you?'" The silence in the room was absolute. Some investors were already beginning to rise discreetly, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the scandal unfolding before their eyes. However, David wasn't finished yet. He looked directly at Victoria, and for the first time, she saw in his eyes no longer the submissive employee she had despised for 4 years. She saw a man who had transformed every humiliation into fuel, every injustice into evidence, every moment of forced invisibility into an opportunity to gather information. "The most fascinating thing, Miss Ashford, is that during all those years of driving your car, you never once inquired about my educational background. You never wanted to know why someone with a magna cum laude degree in business from Howard University would accept a job as a chauffeur." He paused for effect. "If you had asked, you might have known that people with photographic memories and training in systems analysis are particularly skilled at documenting behavioral patterns and organizing evidence." Victoria finally understood the true magnitude of what she was confronting. This was not a resentful employee making baseless accusations. This was a highly educated strategist who had spent 4 years infiltrating her life, systematically collecting evidence of her crimes while she treated him like furniture. Rachel Morrison stepped up to the microphone. "This is only the first part of our investigation. Over the next week, we will reveal documents proving a corruption scheme involving public contracts, bid manipulation, and systematic discrimination against minority employees at Victoria Ashford's companies." That was when Victoria made her most desperate mistake. She stood up abruptly, attempting to leave the hall, but David intercepted her with a question that echoed throughout the room. "Ms. Ashford, where are you going? We haven't reached the part about the undeclared taxes from the offshore account in the Cayman Islands yet." Victoria froze. That information was her best-kept secret, known only to her personal accountant, and she remembered with horror the numerous phone calls she had made to her accountant from a backseat of her car, with David sitting just a few feet away. For 4 years, she had treated her driver like an inanimate object, never imagining that every whispered word, every document left on the seat, every private phone conversation was being absorbed by a mind that forgot absolutely nothing. Now, in front of national cameras and all the investors she needed to impress, Victoria Ashford finally understood that she had underestimated not just an employee, she had underestimated an adversary who had turned her own arrogance into a weapon of her destruction. Worst of all, looking at that briefcase still full of documents, she realized that David hadn't revealed even half of what he knew. The woman who had always prided herself on her business acumen had just discovered that for 4 years she had been watched, analyzed, and documented by someone infinitely more strategic than she had ever imagined possible. The mention of offshore accounts was the moment Victoria Ashford realized she wasn't just dealing with a resentful employee. She was facing someone who had enough information to completely destroy her life. "I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, but her voice came out shaky and unconvincing. David smiled for the first time with genuine satisfaction. "You don't know? Then perhaps you need to hear this phone call from August 23rd when you instructed your accountant to transfer $2.7 million to account number. He paused dramatically. Well, I'm sure you remember the numbers. The panic in Victoria's eyes was visible from across the room. She tried to move closer to David, whispering desperately, "What do you want? Money? I can transfer any amount today." "Money?" David laughed, a humorless sound. "Ms. Ashford, for 4 years, you paid me exactly $42,000 annually to drive your car, while you kept millions in secret accounts. Do you really think this is about money?" Rachel Morrison approached with a tablet in her hand. "Ms. Ashford, our investigation also uncovered something interesting about the Fifth Avenue housing project, the same project where you displaced 17 black families using forged documents." Victoria tried to deny it, but David held up another document. "Here's a recording of you telling your lawyer, 'These people can't read contracts. Use the most complicated language you can find, and they'll sign anything.'" The room was completely silent. Cameras captured every bead of sweat on Victoria's face, every tremor in her perfectly manicured hands. The investors who remained in the room looked at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. "David, please," she begged, all her previous arrogance completely evaporated. "We can talk in private. I can make up for all this." "Make it up." David turned to the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, for 4 years, this woman treated me like a piece of furniture. She never asked my full name, never knew I had a daughter, never cared that I slept in my car because I couldn't afford rent after paying my mother's medical bills." He calmly leafed through his folder. "But what strikes me most is how someone who considers herself a philanthropist can say things like this." David played another recording. Victoria's voice echoed through the hotel. "These blacks need to learn that they can't just demand equality. They have to earn the right to be in the same spaces as us." The silence that followed was deafening. Several people in the audience stood up and left, visibly embarrassed. Camera flashes captured the look of absolute terror on Victoria's face. That was taken out of context. She cried desperately, but her voice sounded hysterical and unconvincing. David just nodded calmly. "Context, Ms. Ashford? This recording was made while you were on the phone with your sister discussing why you fired 3 black employees in the same week. Would you like me to play the rest of the conversation?" Then something happened that no one expected. Victoria's phone began to ring incessantly. Text messages arrived one after another. She looked at the screen and her face drained of color. "My God," she whispered, reading the messages. "My investors they're canceling all the contracts." Rachel Morrison approached the microphone. "I must inform you that this press conference is being broadcast live on CNN. So far, it has been watched by over 2 million people." Victoria turned to David with tears of despair in her eyes. "You destroyed my entire life. I built this empire over 30 years. David stared at her with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural. "Mrs. Ashford, I haven't destroyed anything. You built your own destruction over 4 years, word by word, while I drove your car. I just documented it." At that moment, 2 men in suits approached Victoria. "Mrs. Ashford, we're with the Internal Revenue Service. We need to talk to you about some irregularities in your tax returns." Victoria looked around desperately, searching for an ally, a friendly face. But the few investors remaining in the room looked at her with the same contempt she had shown David for 4 years. "How?" she whispered, looking at David. "How did you get all this?" David calmly closed his briefcase and stood up. For the first time in 4 years, he looked down on her, not physically, but morally. "Ms. Ashford, for 4 years, you completely underestimated me. You never asked about my education, never questioned why someone with my qualifications would accept being your driver." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "If you had asked, you would have discovered that people with a background in business and photographic memory are particularly good at 2 things: recognizing criminal patterns and building solid cases against those who think they can walk all over anyone without consequences." The sound of sirens began to echo outside the hotel. Victoria looked out the window and saw several police cars approaching. "David," she pleaded one last time, "I can change. I can be better. Please." David looked at her with a mixture of pity and determination. "Ms. Ashford, For 4 years, I listened to you humiliate not only me but dozens of other people, employees, suppliers, anyone you considered inferior. You had 4 years to choose to be a better person. He turned to the cameras. True justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that innocent people don't suffer at the hands of those who abuse power. As federal agents approached Victoria with arrest warrants, she finally understood the true extent of her downfall. In a matter of hours, she had lost her company, her reputation, her freedom, and most importantly, the respect she had spent decades building. David watched as she was led out of the hall, her handcuff reflecting the camera lights. For 4 years, she had treated him as if he were invisible. Now, ironically, she was the one who would disappear from the society she valued so much, while he emerged as a symbol of dignity and strategic intelligence. But as Victoria faced the consequences of decades of arrogance and prejudice, one question remained. Is the fall of a tyrant enough to heal the wounds of all those who suffered in silence? Or are there even deeper lessons about justice and redemption waiting to be revealed? 6 months later, David Thompson sat in his new office on the 23rd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, looking out at the city through panoramic windows. As executive director of the Social Justice Foundation he had created with the money from the rights to his story, he had turned his experience into a platform to help other exploited workers. Victoria Ashford, on the other hand, was serving a 5-year sentence for tax evasion and corruption. Her assets had been confiscated, her contracts canceled, her reputation destroyed forever. The woman who had once considered David invisible was now just a number in the prison system. "Dad, do you regret exposing her like that?" Sophie asked during dinner at his new apartment. David smiled, hugging his daughter. "Princess, I didn't destroy Victoria Ashford. I just showed the world who she really was behind her philanthropist mask. True revenge was never about humiliating her. It was about building something better than she ever could." David's foundation had already helped more than 200 workers expose abusive employers, always with a motto he had learned the hard way. The best revenge is a success your enemies never thought possible. If this story of transformation touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that no matter how powerful those who try to destroy you are, true strength lies in using injustice as fuel to build something greater than anyone dared to imagine.